Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. This is an extraordinarily important topic, and I'm going to start off very briefly with each of you talking about what you do, so people have an idea of what your job is and how you relate to it. And we're going to start off, once we begin, talking about something that's in the news today, which is encryption. There was what we consider in the United States a terrorist attack on a church in Texas. And once again, it looks like the murderer had an iPhone that's encrypted, and there's going to be a fight again with Apple over not giving over encryption, not opening the phone for federal authorities. So why don't we start on the end? Why don't you explain what you do and what your area of expertise is, and then we'll move on down.
Yeah, good morning. I'm speaking very loudly, obviously. Rob Wainwright, Director of Europol. So I run the European Police Agency that is helping national authorities around Europe. We have about 1,000 of them on our platform in sharing intelligence every day and running joint operations against terrorist groups and organized crime groups across Europe with a bunch of other countries, including especially the United States, that are involved in our programs as well. In this area of tech against terrorism, of note is a job of running the EU Internet Referral Unit, which is a coordinating point right across the law enforcement community in Europe for single point of engagement with the social media partners, over 80 of them that we are regularly working with, to identify and quickly remove terrorist content online. It's been a very successful example in this space of public-private partnership, and so with all of the sort of difficulty on the encryption debate, very often that you see polar opposite views between law enforcement and the tech industry. In this particular space, there's been largely a meeting of minds, working along voluntary codes of conduct to remove an awful lot of terrorist content online. And I'm happy to say, therefore, that's a more positive aspect of the way that we're engaging with the industry at the moment.
Great.
Hey, I'm Adam from Tech Against Terrorism. Tech Against Terrorism is a project run on behalf of UNCTAD, so that's the United Nations Counterterrorism Executive Directorate. And we're also working with the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, which is a coalition between Facebook, Microsoft, Google, and Twitter, all focused on developing improved technology and process to deal with terrorist exploitation of the internet. And what we've been doing since 2016 is running a variety of workshops with startups all over the world and developing content and tools to help smaller companies address this issue. Our scope for the project is all sorts of technology companies. Obviously, we work with the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, but also with companies regarding social media, content storage, fintech, encryption, VPN, e-commerce, and all other types of companies. And the premise of our work is that the smaller technology platforms also require some support, some advice and capacity building. It's not just a question of the big players and social media, but a much broader question of how terrorists exploit technology.
Good morning. My name is Stephan Husy. I'm a Swiss diplomat. My job is to develop policy and legal frameworks at an international level to counter terrorism and to prevent violent extremism.
Okay.
My name is Sasha Havlicek. I run the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and for about a decade now, we've been looking to pioneer responses to the rising challenges of hate and violent extremism. As that challenge has migrated online and then onto social media platforms, we have increasingly been working with partners in the technology sector. We have major programs that have pioneered responses and interventions along that radicalization spectrum, running with Facebook, with Microsoft, with Google. And we do a range of things, from educating and supporting civil society organizations, educating young people to be more resilient. But we also work with a range of governments, including international institutions, the Global Counterterrorism Forum. We work closely with Adam as well, to support them in developing digital strategies and policies that can help us get through this major challenge.
Okay, so we're going to talk about the removal of social media, because that is an area that has been exploited by a lot of groups, not just terrorists, but others. But I want to start first talking about encryption, because I think one of the issues, it's one of the major issues, at least in the United States, around law enforcement and the uses of different legal means to try to extract information from these companies, because they have a cornucopia of information. Why don't we start with you, Robert, talking about this issue, because today, for those who don't know, there was a shooting in Texas, a very brutal murder of many people by someone that is considered a terrorist in the United States. And he has an iPhone, and very similar to the attack in San Bernardino. It's not clear. It seems like he has an iPhone. It's not entirely clear if it's an iPhone. But the last time this happened, it created a lot of controversy in the United States, because Apple declined to help the federal government get into the iPhone, and they're not apparently not hackable by our government our government intelligence agencies. So why don't we start with you talking about this issue, because it looks like this is a very emotional issue right now, because so many people are killed, and at the same time for Apple and other companies like Google and Microsoft, it's also something they don't want to wade into, given their feeling that they're protecting the rest of everybody else from incursions by the government and government agencies. So it looks like it's going to pop up again. It's going to and get very emotional quickly.
Yes, and it's a permanent issue, I think, and an example, of course, of the dichotomy of value that technology presents in the field of security, where, of course, encryption and technology as a whole, wonderful benefits that it provides us. Without encryption, we don't have e-commerce. Without encryption, we don't have security of our personal communication. So it's absolutely necessary, and strong encryption at that. But of course, it's also fantastically abused at scale by terrorists and others who seek to do us serious harm. And none of us yet, I think, in our respective communities have yet solved that great dilemma about how to promote one and mitigate the effects of the other. And I think at the heart of the encryption debate and the public dispute between the FBI and Apple was a reflection of the extent to which, since Snowden, there's been a serious divergence of interests between law enforcement, government on one side, and the tech industry on the other. That's quite different to how it was in the days after 9/11.
Absolutely.
And one can understand why that's happened since the Snowden revelations, but generally had a very corrosive effect on the ability of law enforcement authorities to engage in a productive way with the tech sector, so that we can combat the effects of these very modern and challenging effects of, say, terrorism and serious crime. There's no doubt that today encryption plays a role in nearly every major inquiry, certainly that my agency is involved in, against serious crime and terrorism. So it's a big roadblock. Absolutely it is. Now, that doesn't mean we should ban encryption. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have strong encryption, because that would be an overreaction, and it would have effects on society that are not worth it, frankly. But it does pose a challenge for how we can rebuild that relationship between the tech industry and law enforcement. It does pose a significant regulatory challenge, and one in which, at the heart of it, is this almost intellectual dishonesty in the debate, which is where we, as a society, we have successfully and rather happily legislated for the fact that police can intercept private telephone calls, but we've not yet engaged with that on the online environment. And if nothing else, whatever your points of principle on this, if nothing else, is a great inconsistency in logic, in emotion, in the way in which we've drawn up legislation.
But
the mere fact that a terrorist can choose to use a WhatsApp message to exchange information rather than a private telephone call makes all the difference to the ability of law enforcement to stop the next terrorist attack. And that can't be right. So that's the frustration that law enforcement have, that regulators have not yet solved that conundrum. To be fair to them, to be fair to the tech industry, it is extremely challenging to translate the regime that we have covering telephone communications in the same very proportionate and targeted way in the internet environment. That's the essence of the problem here and the challenge that we face. but we still haven't done enough to address
it's
that.
an interesting issue because it's not the same thing as a phone call. You're opening up the entire phone and all the other information available on it. And you're absolutely right, the distrust between the government and these companies, which are largely in the U.S., because WhatsApp is owned by Facebook and some of the other technologies, the same thing. And they're owned by the same companies, essentially. And the distrust is pretty obvious given the incursions that the government has been trying to make. And it's not, a phone call is a phone call, but the phone is everything. It's not just a single piece of information. And then they're worried about phishing and looking for other things. But in that case, I'd love to know from someone else on the panel, when you think about that dichotomy and where they part, and it's quite a drastic parting, one of the things when I've been talking to the technology companies is that they feel that the government, all the governments they're dealing with, have many minds within their governments. In the case of the San Bernardino attack, the head of the Defense Department was on Apple's side, while the FBI director was on another side, while President Obama was on yet another side. And so for the Defense Department, encryption is really important, and incursions and the ability to hack into sophisticated encryptions was an issue. So what is that? Is there an actual answer? Because when you open a phone, you open everything pretty much, and ruin their businesses too at the same time.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, and echoing some of the comments that Rob made. As a UN project, we're mandated by the Security Council, and the full title of our work is Preventing the Terrorist Exploitation of the Internet whilst Respecting Human Rights, which speaks to a really important issue here of balance and developing technology that at its heart takes into account the complexities of systems that are clearly fundamental to our way of life and to our democracies as well. Now, rather than speaking about a particular incident, I think it's perhaps helpful zooming out a bit here and saying that this is an issue of regulation, this is an issue of norms and definitions too. As a project, what we're focused on is capacity building with the broader tech industry, and part of that is trying to help them understand the laws and the regulations that exist. But a big issue there, which you're alluding to, is that there's not a lot of agreement at the international level about a lot of these issues, let alone at the national level. So what we're calling for is a lot more coordination from governments, from legislators, to actually decide what is and is not acceptable, and then actually putting it into law, because there are a lot of issues in terms of the law. So one issue here is internet intermediary liability. So in the US, there's Section 230 of the Communications and Decency Act, which gives companies almost absolute immunity for content that they have on their systems. That is actually the law. Likewise, in the European Union, there's the e-commerce directive, which has a similar type of idea. So the issue here is that there is already law in this case, but sometimes governments and policymakers are not fully aware of the implications of some of these things. So that when governments are asking for content takedown, actually that doesn't necessarily align with the law in terms of internet intermediary liability.
I want to get to content takedown. I want to talk about encryption specifically, because it's a much more, I think they're very clear on content takedown in most cases. But in the case of encryption, they're absolutely vehemently not wanting to do this. And it's every tech company, from Microsoft to Apple. They don't speak as loudly as Apple did, but it certainly is their point of view. So, go ahead.
Encryption is very important, and I think it's clear that backdoors, for example, are not acceptable.
Right.
But I think there is a lot of data anyway, so the metadata you cannot encrypt. So I think first the data that is accessible should be used in a more efficient way. There should be more exchange of information. But definitely the human rights and right to privacy, they are offline and online, and that sets certain restrictions to the desire. I can understand an investigator to have access to that, but I think there have to be limits. And definitely encryption is extremely important for a secure internet, which we are all benefiting from.
Yeah. Sasha, you talked about this, that there's other methods of doing it. And one of the things when we were I was lucky enough to interview President Obama, and this is an issue we argued about. But he, when he was campaigning, he was talking about privacy and the protection of data and everything else. And when he became president, he changed rather drastically and was behind the idea of decrypting things and getting information. And I said, you've shifted. He said, no, I haven't. I said, no, it's a really dramatic shift. And he said, well, I've seen some of the terrorist chatter coming over. When you see, you don't want one iPhone to have, if you didn't get into an iPhone or didn't get into a cell phone, that a terrorist attack happened and you weren't able to prevent it because that. And it was, it's a very emotional argument, and politicians take advantage of that idea. And to me, when you say that, it's very clear, and at the same time, it opens a cornucopia of issues. And I think my response was, so all of civilization rests on a single iPhone? You don't have other tools to figure out terrorist attacks and things like that?
And this is the bottom line. You can regulate, potentially, in one market, in 3 markets, in 10 markets. But there will be somewhere that will not regulate. And we know this now. We live, of course, in a world where we have different rules applied in different places. So the reality of the impact of doing this kind of thing is quite limited anyway. Because they will be using encryption.
Well, if they don't have the iPhone, they'll go to WhatsApp. They'll go to WhatsApp. They go to Telegram. It's like a string of...
And this is part of the challenge for the companies, that they are working in a very fragmented juridical space around the world. And one of the issues that Adam is trying to work on, one of the things that we're trying to do is try to work towards harmonization. And juridical review and due process and so on, very, very important in this space. But the reality is, right now, we better get much better at old-fashioned intelligence work. In order to be able to break through this particular challenge, we're going to have people on the ground doing the old-fashioned thing, which is infiltrating groups and doing this. And I think that there is a recognition in intelligence services that that's going to have to be the approach for this side of the problem. You said that there's a consensus around the removal of terrorist content. I think that's... interesting that you have that perception. It's not the perception I have. I think there's a lot of...
oh, no, I agree with you.
Similar,
Yeah, I agree with you. So, Robert, just finishing this up, where do you imagine there being a way that they could come together? Because in this case, I don't think there is one. There isn't a, oh, yes, or there doesn't... It seems to be pretty firm on the part of tech companies, especially because it does go to the heart of their businesses. You can't have e-commerce. You can't... Amazon's on that side, all the big companies. And it's the one thing they're willing to put up with an enormous amount of public backlash on, up to the point of hurting their images, which is somewhat interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I've had interesting exchanges with smaller tech firms who are engaged especially in developing stronger encryption capabilities. And one of the interesting things they told me, you expect from their perspective to be a million miles away from somebody like me, but they said, we can help you. Why don't you ask us and our specialists to come in and help your analysts, your police analysts, to develop your decryption capabilities generally? No, you laugh, but that's part of the point.
No, I can see them doing that.
Now, that's not giving a backdoor to any particular to the iPhone or any form of encryption device, but it is helping law enforcement to develop their general decryption capabilities so that it can be applied in specific cases under judicial supervision when we most need it. And so if you brought the brightest minds of law enforcement intelligence and Silicon Valley together, then there is something that you can do there. And of course I accept also the point that Sasha made about, we have to find other more inventive ways to do our work as well. Although good old-fashioned intelligence, by the way, Sasha, is always involved in deceptive communications. So it's a major hole, actually, to cover. But I accept that there are other ways, and we're already beginning to do that to cover some of the gap. So I think, Kara, that's what I want to see. I want to see, actually, some general help towards law enforcement to do our job better anyway, and using some of their capabilities and expertise in this area.
Yeah, but I'm just curious what you think when you have those emotional response. I mean, I thought the FBI director did himself a disservice by it was interesting because he was doing something that was quite threatening and emotional and trying to appeal to, I'm not really clear who, and Apple sort of was very not. They were like very firm. Their messaging was the same. they were very their messaging was very high-minded about their business and about their customers, and that they were protecting other people that they didn't realize. Where do you? I'm just trying to think where the twain will meet, because it seems like on this issue, especially when they're developing even more sophisticated encryption methods, which will be impossible to decrypt, or what I'm told. I'm told some of the ones that are being developed are even more difficult to hack into. And then they tried. I think in the case of San Bernardino, I'm not sure if they were successful, but you're not really clear if they are or not.
No, I think it's always going to be more difficult to force a meeting of minds,
right.
a meeting of hearts and minds, indeed, by going public with your dispute, or even going down taking it to court. So this is about building productive relationships, behind the door.
Right.
And in a way that's building trust. Now, go back to that factor. We just need to get back around the table, be sensible, more grown up about it. I think behind the scenes, a lot of that is actually happening,
sure.
even in this area, to be honest. But I don't think we should be exposing the differences that we have in public. I think that's generally unhelpful.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens here, because I don't know if you heard, we have a president who likes to tweet, and I think he was very involved.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Yeah. I'd like to decrypt him. But what was interesting was that he got involved. He particularly was very vocal on this issue. So I suspect in the Texas case, he's going to make it worse than it is. That's what create a worse situation because of lack of cooperation. He'll make it an emotional, political issue. So let's move on to the one where they do agree on a little more, although I think you're right that they don't. Is the removal of content, and whose content should be removed, and who is a terrorist and who is not. There's varying debate when it comes to ISIS. Most of these tech companies will remove and monitor this content. When it comes to Russia, they apparently didn't know it was there. And then when it comes to Charlottesville, they let it flourish. With Nazi organizations and things like that. And so it's a little more complicated. Sasha, why don't you talk about this issue? Because content removal seems to be a relatively easy subject, like take down the terrorist organization. But it's not. And especially when you have a libertarian mindset, First Amendment mindset from most of those tech companies and their founders.
I mean, there's two things. Content is, of course, context.
Right.
Everything is context. Mm-hmm. And so there is a terrible set of, law of unintended consequences that can happen with content removal. This is not to say that we shouldn't be attempting to remove a layer of content that is clearly egregious. But I would ask everybody here, would you know terrorist content if you saw it? Because actually the most effective terrorist content out there is often the non-violent terrorist content. Mm-hmm. And we've just classified terrorist content in a way to simplify it in order to work with smaller companies to understand what that might look like into 9 categories. From violent through to non-violent, from branded through to non-branded, and so on. And then understanding a little bit better the impact of each of those categories on recruitment, which is the problem, which is the thing we're trying to stop. So there's just that. And then whose terrorist organization?
Yeah, which one?
Who's defining that? Even that, we have no consensus on internationally. So there's a whole set of problems here that we are giving the companies to solve. Part of those challenges I think we need to be taking on board on a cross industry basis, because and so then is the question of who makes the decision and why, on what basis. I think there's another thing. There is a set of unintended consequences that we see with some of the best attempts at this. So there's an example of footage of terrible atrocities committed against civilians in Syria by the Assad regime, which was removed because it was violent and it seemed like terrorist content. Now, there is a lot of content that human rights organizations are trying to get visibility for that raises, the flag on hideous crimes that otherwise wouldn't be seen by the world. Context is a very, very challenging thing here. Then there is the question of what is it that we're trying to achieve? So there's a lot of talk now in policy circuits about having to remove that content within a 2-hour time frame.
Right.
That's the objective, because in fact, content has done its damage within that 2-hour time frame, and so on. And of course, the big focus has been on the four big companies. But the migration onto smaller platforms, of course, is absolutely dramatic, and so we're constantly sort of running after. There's a kind of whack-a-mole challenge here. Not to say that we mustn't be making those efforts, but it is very complex. I'd say the other thing is that we forget that there are other things that we can do and we need to be doing at the same time. They may not have the same immediacy, but ultimately long term, we need to be educating to get people resilient to what they're seeing and what they're engaging with online, and how content is being pushed to them. I think there is a set of issues around the algorithms that amplify and target, and the impact that has on individual users that might be vulnerable to certain types of content. And so how quickly do you get enclosed into an ecosystem that is feeding back to you?
Right,
that iterative process is actually quite damaging.
Right, there's a lot to unpack here. So let's talk about that, because it is more, it's not as easy as the thing. You want to stop recruitment, you want to do things. There's lots of platforms. It's not clear who decides who a terrorist is. So, why don't you talk about this, Stephan?
Yeah, I think what is really required is a strategic approach. So let's talk first about illegal content, terrorist content. Of course, this has to be taken down, blocked. Now, there is some definitional issues, but what we see is now much more international cooperation, and Rob just mentioned the internet referral units. But this has to be very clear, so you have to mention what legal basis you're applying to that. And but for example, there is no obligation of platforms to know the customers. In the financial sector, you do. So when there is a sanction list of the UN Security Council with persons and organizations, of course they are prohibited to open an account, an internet account. But so I think there is more maybe due diligence on the side of internet providers, which is important. But that's really, and then we have the investigation, we have e-evidence. We just heard before the session before how to keep the e-evidence, all that. But then, and that's sometimes mixed up, we have the prevention. So prevention of radicalization. So we are not looking at the perpetrators, at the terrorists, at the recruiters, at the facilitators, but we are looking at persons who are unstable, who are vulnerable, who could be open for these messages. And this is not illegal content there on their side. So they might ask to start to ask questions. How is the situation in Raqqa? Well, that's now over. What's the opportunities to get training, to become a nurse? This is not illegal, but I think it's a marker, or you should detect these kind of journeys of people. And I think the tech companies have a role to play. But that's not the law enforcement. That's really the prevention of radicalization processes.
Well,
and I think that's to separate
to say that, because
things.
the minute you said that, only because I've spent so much time in Silicon Valley, I don't agree with most of the time, but I thought they're not going to do that because they don't want to be arbiters. They really don't.
No.
And they use, they're very free. People have their own free will. I don't think that's the case. I think they create exactly that. They create psychological. It's almost impossible to resist some of the stuff that they're doing and they're spending time on. How do you broach that? Because I think it really is a much more, as Sasha said, a problematic issue because it's complicated, and once you hit one thing, you hit another problem where there's decision making, and most of these companies in general have a deeply hands-off concept, despite the fact that they're incredibly influential using these tools, and they spend a lot of time getting people to use these tools for other means, to play a game or to do whatever.
Well, of course, when people talk about technology, the word disruption comes up a lot, and often you're talking about economic models, so Uber disrupting taxis and so on. But also you could say that technology is questioning some fundamental tenets of how we think about regulation and about law. And that applies to social media as it does to all sorts of technology companies. And our view here is that where content's concerned, there are some really serious questions that haven't really been answered by governments, by academics, and by policymakers. So going back to a point that was raised earlier, is if we're talking about harmful content, is that illegal content? How do you define illegality in this area? But also there's a bit of conflation between violent content on the one hand, depictions of a beheading or something horrendous like that, and more subtle content that may influence, but actually potentially falls under freedom of speech. So how do you actually define these things? And I think the problem that tech companies have, the big ones and the small ones, is they need to operationalize this, because we're talking about billions of users.
Yeah.
So actually it needs to be quite clear, because machine learning and artificial intelligence can only go so far. Humans are always required. So I think the onus actually is on the policy community to get a bit better at reaching consensus and harmony regarding the legality and the harm that can be done by content, and then the tech industry can do something with that.
And there is no such consensus at the moment, I
No,
should
not
say.
at all.
And on this point about strategy, if I might, you're absolutely right. We require a strategy. But actually, there is an absence of such a strategy, in the sense that we still don't have a framework for measuring success. So we keep having the lambasting of companies, the lambasting of governments, back and forth. Do more of what? 250,000 accounts removed by Twitter.
Right.
Is that great? Is that terrible?
Yeah.
Nobody has any idea of what that actually means.
Well, I
so
think
there's no benchmark.
Well, I have some metrics.
Okay, go ahead.
And that's the success rate that we have in referring our content according to our own definition of terrorism, of course, in the European Union, and how much of that is removed and how quickly it's removed. And so we can see the largest social media companies have a pretty good record, above 90% in that space. I think the speed of takedown has to improve, and we're working on that. And then there are some other companies, Telegram being a notable one, where there's zero interaction and engagement on their side. But generally, the industry is in a helpful, constructive place here. And although I don't dismiss it, Sasha or Adam, completely, I think this largely academic debate about what is terrorism, clearly we have to get to that point. For the moment, to be honest, it's hard enough for people like me just to deal with terrorism that really does look, in everyone's eyes, to be terrorism. To be the way in which the internet and social media especially has completely transformed the fortunes of ISIS, especially in its ability to propagandize and recruit. And the fact that we had a very stylish video glorifying the attacks in Paris, and that was watched 1 million times within 36 hours. The fact that we've seen obvious attempts to encourage people to come to Syria and Iraq, to join the caliphate, engage in terrorism, where we've had obvious examples across social media of encouragement to people saying, if you can't come here, kill a police officer. Drive a car in a crowded place. The instructions and the advice and the encouragements have been that obvious and that specific, and that's exactly what's followed on the streets of Europe in such terrible form over a number of incidents in the last 3 years. This is obviously terrorism. It obviously needs to be removed as quickly as possible. There's obviously an enormous amount of it out there, and that's our task for the moment. We have to just deal with that. And then, of course, this longer-term debate, which is still important, frankly, is a secondary objective for us at the moment.
So when you can clearly identify ISIS, but I think those are not edge. The rest of them are not necessarily edge cases. I'm thinking because there's been a big debate about Nazism on Reddit, which they've just put out new rules of what's allowed to be put up and where they're putting it. A lot of times they move it elsewhere, making it harder to find. That's one of their solutions.
Of course.
Which I don't think is a solution, really. Let's put the racists over here in the closet or something like that, because they're still there, and people that can find them will find them. And it's a good argument you made. If you hide them, it's better, essentially, and then you don't have to deal with the First Amendment issues. But they're not even edge cases like Nazism, which is just the same thing. The same recruiting videos, the same, some of it quite close to violence, or at least suggestive of violence. ISIS is easy. I don't want to say, dealing with that, it's easy. It's an easy press release. It's an easy thing for the companies to say they're doing something about. And it should say that you don't know if the 250,000 accounts are going to affect things. But it's an easier solution. When you get to the more complicated things, what is your argument as a law enforcement?
Yeah, I think governments can help and advise, but in the end, this has got to come from industry. I think because what is interesting here is that the process of referral and takedown is not being enforced on the companies at all. We have no powers,
Right.
legislative powers to do that. It's all acted through the companies enacting their own terms and conditions. Now,
Right.
what I'd like to see is a more common set of definitions in their terms
they
and
share.
conditions that they share. And they are engaging in a much more collaborative basis. What is really important development right now is the automatic referral of certain videos according to a common hash database that we're helping them to develop, so that goes across, almost automatically goes across all or as many of the social media platforms as possible. We're at the early stages of doing that only, and most of the smaller companies are not yet engaged in that. But if we get to that point, then even the stuff that's been pushed in the closet hopefully can get automatically found out.
Well, I'd like to know from all of you, do you really want Mark Zuckerberg to decide who a terrorist is? And and just from the incidents around Russia, for example, they don't have control of their own platforms. That's their story right now. Who knows what happened? And in some cases, I believe it, because you look at some of the chaos internally at these companies, and then billions and billions of transactions that are happening all the time. They've lost control of their platform. I want to finish up talking about, are there other tools to stop this? One of the ones that Mark discussed in his giant essay about these issues, about community and stuff like that, was the use of AI. And if each of you, we've just got a few minutes, is that the solution? Is that there's technological solutions beyond? You said you always need humans. I do agree on that. I think one of the problems they had was firing humans. But can each of you talk really briefly, because we only have 3 minutes, about the uses, what other technologies can be used to prevent this? So, why don't we start here and then?
Yeah, I just want to say I'm not in any way suggesting that we shouldn't be starting with the most egregious stuff and making sure that we're doing everything to remove that swiftly, and the hashing database. And your purpose around that specific content has meant that there's been real impact, though still the proportion of content being removed through IRU referrals is very small compared to the total. We need to do more in this space, so I completely agree with that. But AI, I think each of the companies, now the big companies, has committed to using machine learning and AI to this purpose more. There is a human review piece of work that has to happen on the tail end to avoid the unintended consequences piece.
Right.
And as we progress in this space, we need to test these responses and look at what the negative implications might be for different constituencies. We need to be careful about what we do. Just one point, counter speech. We need to compete with this stuff, and we also need to be using the tools available here, technological tools, communication strategies, to do proper competition with the extremists who are deploying very successfully, very professionally. So there are other ways in which we create an ecosystem. We need to look at this space as an ecosystem.
So get more
User
noisy.
journey,
Great.
more going on.
More noisy.
More noisy.
Yeah. Very quickly, because we only got 2 minutes.
I think that for the law enforcement part, I think it's really on track, and that's the tools are there. I think there should be much more emphasis on preventing radicalization processes, and of course, these technologies can be very helpful. I mean, these tech companies, they are social media platforms. They are the champions of advertising. So they know how to discover and detect certain features or certain interests and all that. I think with the data available, you just should feed in journeys of people who became later terrorists, how it started. It's very much based on research as well. What's, for example, the fact that many of the Europeans who are radicalizing, they have a track record on illegal pornography. I mean, what does it tell you about the drivers? And how do you detect, the early detection of radicalization process? Yeah. That's one thing. And then you need, of course, the response. And that's not only, I tell you, not only online. This has to be offline as well. Consulting and all that, education, etc. Okay. That's what I mean. You need it. But I see a role. Yeah. Yes, definitely.
So in terms of technology, certainly machine learning has a role to play, specifically reinforcement learning, and certainly the only way that platforms of such scale can be correctly or appropriately understood in this way is with machine learning, but people will always be required. So what we're calling for is improved deployment of these technologies, not just in the big players, but the smaller technology companies as well, and also more intelligent sharing. So sharing particular content that may be considered harmful. And those are two tech solutions that will go a long way, because after all, we're talking about a tech problem, partly. I agree that this is an offline issue as well, but that does need a tech solution too. And I think the large social media companies are already working quite hard on that.
All right, and Robert, why don't you finish up?
Yeah, we have to work more at the other end of the pipe, which is much narrower and smaller, i.e. to identify the people who are putting this out here. That goes back to law enforcement intelligence agencies doing their work better to identify who the people are responsible, and that'll capture a lot more of and stop the echo chamber working in the first place.
All right, thank you so much. It's been a great panel. Thank you all for being so thoughtful.
Thank you.